Good day to everyone. My report will focus on Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Richard Mayer's book Multimedia Learning details his extensive research on how to structure multimedia materials effectively to maximize learning. Relying on numerous experiments, he distills his findings into 10 principles that constitute what he refers to as the cognitive theory of multimedia learning. This theory and its principles provide guidance on how to create effective multimedia presentations for learning. What is multimedia learning? Multimedia learning is building mental representations from words and pictures. Cognitive theory of multimedia learning was created by Richard Mayer, a professor of psychology at the University of California, Santa Barbara. It presents principles to guide teachers and instructional designers in the presentation of the verbal and visual information for optimal learning. Information according to the information processing theory, learning comes from these three cognitive processes: sensory memory, working memory, and long-term memory. Information in the form of stimulus like visual or sounds enter into sensory memory with attention. The sensory memory transfer information to the working memory. This area has a limited capacity, and according to psychologist Richard Mayer, it can only hold 7 units of information plus or minus 2 when information is rearranged and organized in a meaningful way. It may activate information from prior knowledge. The information then moves into long-term memory. Long-term memory is considered permanent and has an unlimited capacity. Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning makes three assumptions about how humans process information: the dual channel assumption, the limited capacity assumption, and the active processing assumption. Let's take a closer look at each of the multimedia learning principles. According to Mayer, the dual assumption principle dictates that humans possess separate channels for processing visual and auditory information. The first is the visual pictorial channel, which processes images seen through the eyes, including words displayed on the screen. The other channel is the auditory verbal channel, which processes spoken words. Cognitive theory of multimedia learning recommends using both pictures and words to activate both channels. The limited capacity assumption suggests that humans had a hard limit on the amount of information they can process at any given point. This is probably intuitive to anyone who sat in a sports bar and tried to watch several games at the same time, or tried to listen to the news while having a conversation. Limited capacity principle states that working memory can process only small amounts of information in each channel at one time. As instructors, we don't want to overload the cognitive process, so we have to be very careful in our selection and the use of text, graphics, and other media. Although it's difficult to nail it down, Mayer suggests that most people can maintain maybe 5 to 7 chunks of information in working memory at a given time. He also indicates that individuals at a higher end at that range may have stronger metacognitive strategies which allow them to manage their limited resources more efficiently. According to the active learning principle, there are three cognitive processes in meaningful learning. This first is selecting the words and images and sensory memory with attention, otherwise the information quickly fades away. The second process is rearranging and organizing information in working memory since it has a limited capacity. Integrating the information with prior knowledge moves information into long-term memory. In addition, the active processing assumption asserts that humans don't learn by just passively observing information. Instead, they need to engage in active cognitive processes, namely identifying and selecting relevant material, organizing it into visual and or verbal models, and integrating those new models with prior knowledge. The cognitive theory of multimedia learning fundamentally argues against a knowledge transmission approach to learning in favor of a student-centered knowledge construction model. Students argues are not empty vessels waiting to be filled up with information, but must instead work to synthesize words and in pictures into meaningful information that is stored in long-term memory. This is the Mayer's cognitive theory of multimedia learning. Mayer's cognitive multimedia learning also relies heavily on cognitive load theory. The underlying premise is that kind of information we encounter during learning leads to one of the three different types of processing in the brain. First is the extraneous load, or the extraneous processing. It refers to the wasted cognitive effort on material or details that don't support the learning resources or outcomes. Instructors can minimize extraneous load by selecting essential material and eschewing everything that could distract. Second is the intrinsic load, or the essential processing, refers to the cognitive effort required to represent the materials in working memory and is based on the complexity or difficulty inherent to the learning materials. Instructors should aim to manage intrinsic load by organizing their materials and identifying technical terms in advance. The third is the germane load, or the generative processing. It is an effort required of learners to actually understand the materials and is strongly affected by their motivation. Instructors should optimize germane load by scaffolding learning and pacing material appropriately. In some ways, we can see cognitive load theory as being an extension of the limited capacity assumption. Given that we have a limited ability to process information in real time, instructors should aim to construct multimedia that manage intrinsic load, optimize germane load, and maximize extraneous load to ensure maximum storage in long-term memory. So while Mayer's principles provide insight on how to effectively construct multimedia messages for learning, each also maps to a best practice in managing cognitive load. In short, the cognitive theory of multimedia learning assumes that human mind is dual channel, limited capacity, and has an active processing system, and that presenters must construct multimedia messages to manage all the three types of cognitive load accordingly. Mayer adopts a constructivist view of learning in which multimedia are not simply information delivery systems, but rather cognitive aids for knowledge constructions. So these are the 10 principles behind the cognitive learning theory. The first principle is the redundancy principle. Many multimedia presentations involve a combination of spoken words and on-screen text graphics. However, the redundancy principle suggests that multimedia messages are most effective when learners encounter just spoken words and graphics. When instructors include text on screen, they